Today's technical conference, as you all know, as part of PacifiCorp's service quality report filing on October 29th, they requested 2 technical conferences, this one and then tomorrow at 9 a.m. Today we're going to talk about the emergency response planning for fire risks, including the impacts of proactive de-energization. This is in Docket 18-03517. Turn it over to the company.
You want to do introductions first?
Oh, sure.
Hi, I'm Tim Clark. I'm an attorney at PacifiCorp Rocky Mountain Power.
Hi, I'm Heidi Caswell, and I am in the T&D asset performance area of PacifiCorp.
Janice Sava, Regulatory Manager for Rocky Mountain Power.
Teresa Connors-Perez, Emergency Manager for Rocky Mountain Power.
And I'm Joseph Ballman with the Commission.
Abdul Nasser Abdullah with the Division.
Cheryl Murray with the Office of Consumer Services.
Carol Revelt with the Commission.
I'm Scott Derrick with Operations in PacifiCorp.
I'm Brenda Salter with the Division.
Charles Peterson with the Division.
Joni Zinger with the Division.
Bob Davis with the Division.
Sherry Vance with the Commission.
And as of right now, we don't have anyone on the phone, but we do have 2 people who may call in while we're talking. I also have the sign in if everyone would fill that out.
Thanks everybody for coming. I am going to turn the time over to Heidi Caswell, who introduced herself a minute ago, to kick us off for a discussion that we'd like to have with you all on proactive de-energization. Thanks, Heidi.
So we filed the service quality review report, and several meetings passed. It became fairly important to the group that there was really no reason for a regular conversation, but you asked us to keep in mind if there were things maybe emerging on the horizon that we should consider requesting some sort of conversation in the form of a technical conference. And so as we filed this report, that was part of our thought process. And what was really behind it was when we went through the reliability rulemaking process, we were required as one of the steps to set baselines around our normal performance. And after we had a few years of experience with those performance levels against the baseline, we had improved performance enough that we ended up making some modifications, some reduction in those baselines, and recognize that was the system as it was then, but there may be things emerging on the horizon that might change the performance nature of the system, and it was important for us to keep you apprised of things that were unfolding. And so at the time, I'm sure in many of our minds it was more around DER and those kinds of changed uses of customers' points of delivery. In the meantime, however, with the recent focus, I guess, in terms of fires along the west, it's been important, I think, to have a conversation around how that impacts us as a electric provider and what we do in response to a broad range of emergencies, and then also share a bit of the concepts that exist around proactive de-energization. So just wanted to cue that up and then maybe lay the groundwork for that discussion with some conversation around emergency planning for all hazards, whether they are weather related or a variety of others, and then move into fire mitigation kind of conversation, get you up to speed with what we've been doing there. So I thought in order to help kind of get that background, Teresa is going to discuss a bit about kind of the all hazards planning activity and what happens when when we need to kick into kind of the emergency response mode. So not normal operation.
So I was asked to come today to kind of give a little bit of a background on how we handle incidents. Like Heidi said, all hazards. It could be an outage, it could be a pandemic, earthquake, all kinds of incidents that happen. And so Rocky Mountain Power implements the principles established by NIMS, which is the National Incident Management System, and ICS, Incident Command System, and that's FEMA's programs. Most, I believe all public entities follow these guidelines, and most private are either implementing these or have implemented them and follow them as well. So what it allows us to do is establish common operating principles, bring people from different organizations into one structure, establish one chain of command, and also escalate authority as needed, and also add resources if they're needed as well. So this handout that I gave you, this is just a real basic framework. And if you start like at the bottom, most of our responses to outages are handled at the local, regional level, our tactical response. If our resources are overwhelmed or the incident requires some level of authority that's not present locally, we can open up our emergency operations center. And then everything is handled out of that emergency operations center. Like the state, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the state has the emergency operations center. And it's very much like that. We also they have ESF 12 essential support functions, one of them being, like for instance, the Department of Transportation, the fire, first responders. One of them is the ESF 12, essential support function 12, which is the energy. And I am the liaison to the Emergency Operations Center. If it ever rose to that level, then I would be the one that would either virtually or physically go down to the Emergency Operations Center and then be the liaison between the government, the responders and all the other ESFs in the room with our company to kind of coordinate the response. If it does reach a higher level, we would activate our executive policy group, which is our executives, and they would again have higher authority to make decisions that probably the people in the Emergency Operations Center may or may not have the authority to make, so they would jointly get together and make these decisions based on all the input from not only the tactical, but all the input from financial and all the different executive groups.
Could you maybe give an example of what type of a response that would be, that the executive policy group, not from what kind of emergency or whatever would rise to that level?
It would, like a widespread outage where it was, the outage or the damage was over a widespread area. There were several or many customers out of power. That would be typically, it may even be a pandemic situation. It all depends on the situation whether we would activate that executive policy group. And that's not to say our executives aren't aware when we do open our emergency operations center that they're kept aware and they have input. But this would be a actual, physical opening of their group, and they would probably meet in a room and convene that way. So it would just depend on the situation whether it would activate to that level.
Mm-hmm. Like the storm of 2003 here in Salt Lake, which was pretty major. Was that have been raised to that level?
Yes.
Okay.
And I believe it was. I wasn't around then, but I've heard about it, so yes, I believe it was.
Okay.
And so at any of these points, you can see the dotted line. The Emergency Operations Center interacts with the government cross-sector coordination. I mentioned that I'm the ESF 12 for the state. The Executive Policy Group also would be communicating with the state, making their notifications to the commission, making their notifications to the elected officials at the state level. And then if it rose to that level, our corporate Emergency Operations Center might be activated, and that would be back in Iowa, and that would be on a federal level. if it ever rose to that, where perhaps not only Rocky Mountain Power, but possibly Pacific Power or Nevada Energy was also affected by whatever this incident happened to be. So that would rise to that level. So you can see, I don't know if you're familiar with the NIMS, but we pretty much follow that same framework that FEMA has established for the National Incident Management. We also have, when we open up our Emergency Operations Center, we also open up our Joint Information Center, or some of you may know it as a JIC. And this is where all of our messaging is distributed from, not only to out to our website, could possibly be outbound calling. All of the messaging is coordinated out of that one location, Facebook, Twitter, any kind of messaging that we need to get out to the customers. We also have regional business managers that are assigned to different communities, and so this messaging would go to them, and then they have their contacts that they would disseminate out our message out to the local first responders, and likewise any information that they receive back, for instance, shelters that are going to be opened or evacuations. They can also bring that back to our Emergency Operations Center, and we can help disseminate that out of our call centers and our websites and so forth. The other thing I wanted to mention is we do have mutual assistance agreements, both an internal and an external. The internal is with Berkshire Hathaway Energy, and it is several of the other utilities. And the benefit of that to us is that Pacific Power, which is on in Oregon and California and Washington, and then there's de-energy, which is in Nevada, and then Mid-American, which is in Iowa. So if, say, for instance, there was an event on the Wasatch Front, we would have all of those sister companies that we could pull resources, personnel and utility-related equipment and material from them. And then we also have the external mutual assistance agreement, which is facilitated by the EEI, which is the Edison Electric Institute, and they facilitate that either on a regional level, or if the incident arises to that level, you could we could request them to open it up nationally and become a national response event and pull resources from all over the country. I think probably you've seen that recently with some of the hurricanes and things where they poise the researchers right outside of the impact zone, and they're ready then to deploy as soon as they're allowed to go into the area to help restore service. So I just wanted to give a little bit of just kind of a background of how we operate in not only just our everyday situations, but also if they do escalate, and they actually become a lot more severe. We can also escalate that and add resources as we need to. So with that.
Any questions for Teresa? Any further questions?
Just out of curiosity, how does the company figure out how many people are available for mutual assistance agreements at any one time? Do they just do an assessment of what's going on this month and say, okay, we can let you have 50 guys or 50 people?
Well, what happens is we have a web-based tool. So if, for instance, a requesting company is overwhelmed and they need some mutual assistance resources, they contact the directors of this mutual assistance agreement, and they call a conference call, and they get all the members on, and they explain the situation, and they have an ask, what they call an ask. So we would like this, these many, distribution linemen or trees crews or whatever, and it's all put into a web-based tool, and all the member companies get with their organizations, their management, and determine what can we provide, what are we, able to provide, and then that's put into the tool, and then that allocation is run, and then it kind of at the end shows, okay, who's providing what, and then the requesting company contacts the providing company and makes all the arrangements as far as the logistics. But the agreement is ahead of time, so that, you know, the rules that of pay, the different unions, you know, what we're gonna be reimbursed for, you know, that is all agreed to ahead of time in an agreement, so.
But the request is very much real-time sort of.
The request is real-time and it's web-based, which is real nice because you just input, you know, the ask, and then the providing companies input what they're able to provide. Thanks. You're welcome.
So then that kind of gets us to the discussion around fire mitigation, so the fire planning activities that we've been focused on, and Tim was gonna start that conversation.
Sure, and, you know, I think it's important to put it in context, and before we get into trying to talk about specifics of de-energization and what that means, is number one, to provide you some reassurance and that the concept of de-energization is the choice of last resort. You know, that's if other things that we're doing haven't worked, and so I'm going to very briefly try to hit a few of the main areas of what we do in terms of mitigating the wildfire risk. By no means is this trying to be exhaustive, and I'm also going to go over some big topics really quickly, just in the interest of time, and feel free to interrupt with any particular questions, and if we want to take a little tangent and get into some details, that's fine. I'd start with kind of just the way we approach the question and think about it. We have some internal guidelines that the company has had for many years, but you know, last year I was involved as well in terms of looking at updating those, and just really it forces you to think about the problem or the issue, and we try to separate it conceptually into three different phases or stages. In some ways that matches a chronological passage of time over the course of the year, although there's some overlap. So like, for example, right now, even though it's a little warmer today than it has been the last few weeks, obviously snow's on the ground, and it's not fire season. It's definitely low risk of any kind of wildfire. But we're still thinking about the issue right now, and so we look at this as part of our preparing stage, and so we're doing things like reviewing our policies and updating our policies, reviewing design standards, et cetera. Very much there's a mindset of, you know, what can we do during the fire season to limit ignition risk. There's another element of preparing and preparedness, and that's kind of along the lines of what Teresa was just talking about, of trying to make sure your ducks are in a row and you know what you're going to do when something occurs. And so we call that readiness, and so some of, you know, our efforts are focused on that. And that's fortunately a good part of the year, although it amazed me getting into this in southern Utah. Fire season actually starts relatively early, and so when we get to a fire season, and it's different depending on where you are geographically. Obviously in the southern part of the state it's earlier than up here, but then we enter what we think of as a monitoring phase, and that's where we're actively aware that we are in fire season, and we need to have heightened awareness and vigilance towards what's going on. One specific item I'll mention with respect to monitoring is we implement a system operations policy, and I'll actually provide a few more details on that in a second. And then another thing that we do during the monitoring, or a specific program, is our GIS department, when there are active fires, you know, I'm sure most of you have probably heard of, for example, last summer there was Pole Creek in central Utah, Trail Mountain out by Strawberry Reservoir. One of the things we need to do is to track that and be aware of when that fire is going to threaten our facilities and the network. Obviously there's degrees of potential impact. A fire that's grown within a mile of a remote distribution line is not going to raise the same kind of concerns as you know, a large wildfire that's even within 5 miles of a large transmission line. And fires are pose two great risks to us in that number one, there's a major cost involved in terms of even some of these fires that did not rise to the level of being on the news every day. They take down 100 poles. There's a lot of cost, a lot of effort that goes into putting those poles back up. The other concerns, of course, are the reliability concerns that we're here primarily talking about today. And so our GIS department maps those current fire threats and keeps the operations side aware of what threats are, which direction things are moving. One thing I've learned working with this fire issue is that wind probably plays the biggest role of anything in fire. And you know, if wind is blowing to the east, the fire's going to move that way. Whereas if the wind can shift direction, it's not only going to move that other direction, but can really help in terms of containing the fire if it's pushing it back into an area that's already burned, or it can be devastating in terms of pushing it away from areas in which they thought they had it controlled. So there's a lot of work that goes into that tracking. That's what we view as kind of the monitoring phase. And then the final phase that we look at is the phase that we prefer not to ever get to, and that is responding to an actual fire event. Above all, you know, focus is on safety, and so our people are clearly instructed and encouraged that safety is a paramount concern, and we're not firefighters. That's not our job to go in and try to put out fires. What we do is we call 911 and then very quickly switch into the mode of working with the fire suppression authorities. Because of this interplay of the fire threatens the facilities, and yet we want to keep the lines energized. A lot of times that helps firefighting efforts. There is a great deal of communication between us and the fire suppression agencies, which can range from, for a small fire, that could be just a local fire department. For a large fire, I don't know if people are really familiar with, there's an interagency, I'm gonna get the acronym wrong, but I think it's the National Fire Interagency in short, it's basically the BLM, the National Forest Service, and the state coordinate with each other. They have a facility out here by the airport that got a chance to tour. It's very high tech, where they coordinate their efforts. But those three agencies do an excellent job of working together to coordinate their resources. And for the big fires, they'll have an incident commander that's chosen through that cooperative effort. So you don't have three people who are doing different things. You have one incident commander for the whole effort. And for those big fires, we would be working directly with the incident command and trying to make sure that we coordinate our activities, which directly segues into what we're talking about, in the sense that there are times where they'll say, you know, we need you to de-energize this line because it's, for example, going to threaten the safety of the wildfire fighters out there. And so that's an ongoing dialogue. One of the things we did in our mitigation efforts was try to make sure that we had an open dialogue and a vibrant communication. So one of the things, we've had multiple meetings with the BLM, and we had a large meeting with representatives of the BLM, the National Forest Service, and the state of Utah, their Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. And, you know, I think was very beneficial to facilitating that communication because, like I said, it really does have to take place every morning, if not through the course of the day, and just keeping each other apprised of how we can support them and they can support us as well and help us to keep the lines protected and energized. So those are kind of the three phases and how we look at the problem and go about thinking about it. A couple, I'm just going to mention two of kind of the quote-unquote initiatives or things that took a lot of time and effort that we spent on over the course of the past year. One was, and Heidi was very involved in this, but one of the efforts is mapping, and there are different kinds of maps. For example, the Division of Natural Resources here in the state of Utah has some excellent fire mapping tools, and I recommend looking at those if you ever get involved in this issue. The National Forest Service has a slightly different approach. For the electric utility perspective, there's been a mapping effort, and Heidi's been involved for years with rulemaking in California, debating how should these maps, what inputs should you be looking at, what data should be brought in, how do you weigh it, and all those different things. And so we've been working on that. That model, if you ever see the terms Tier 2 or Tier 3, those are terms used in the California rulemaking that, rather than trying to put together minuscule versions of you know, the fire threat changing every 100 yards or so, the approach that was used there and is somewhat guiding our thinking is trying to look at areas in a broader geographic scope. And so we're trying to look at areas that are higher risk versus moderate risk versus no risk, and so not quite the level of minute detail that you might, like, for example, see in some of the other maps. But that's been a lot of work involved in that. The other specific project I wanted to mention was, as I mentioned earlier, for the monitoring function. you know, of course, we have system operations policies of how to manage the grid. We do have also a specific policy in providing procedures for system operations during fire season. And we really spent a lot of time reevaluating that policy and looking at how we could improve it and bring it as current as possible. So a few differences, kind of just highlights. I won't get into the minutia of the policy, but a few key features I think is, for example, our prior system operations policy looked at fire season as being one-time start to finish for the entire system. And now we say, well, fire season in southern Utah is different than fire season in northern Utah, and so we're actually declaring or having a fire season based on operating districts. So adding that level of detail, which means that there would be a slightly different, you know, at one time San Juan is going to be in fire season, and another time Box Elder County, for example, was going to be going into fire season at a later time. Probably the most critical change to the policy, though, was integrating the concept of red flag days. The National Weather Service, of course, expends considerable resources monitoring climatic data and weather patterns, and the National Weather Service provides a service of publishing what are called red flag days. And those are essentially days of elevated fire risk, and that is usually applies to a county. So I mean, they're not going to declare a red flag day for the entire state of Utah, but they may declare a red flag day for Summit County or a portion of Summit County. We are integrating that publication by the National Weather Service into how we manage the grid. And so on days when there are red flag warnings, we are going to have some more conservative policies and basically a more conservative approach in two basic areas, and that is the recloser policy and the no test policy.
What is the no test policy?
I was afraid you were going to ask, because, and this is Heidi's going to correct me if I get any of the technical statement wrong.
And if I get it wrong, then Scott's going to correct me, right?
So the recloser policy, there are automatic reclosers, in that if a breaker opens, there's a device that will attempt to close the circuit, and if it successfully closes, then the auto recloser has worked. And the intent on those are to protect reliability, that if there was a very brief fault, the recloser is going to close back into that. And so the settings on that recloser, how quickly it will reclose, and the number of times it will reclose is a factor to consider. Another factor to consider is that for many reclosers we have SCADA remote control ability to turn those on and off. And so during fires, outside of fire season, we may never turn the reclosers off. But during fire season, there may be circumstances where we actually turn off the auto reclosing function for particular auto reclosers because of the fire risk. And so that's one tool to use. The no test policy is getting into if the recloser opens and does not reclose, the system operator, the person in the room at North Temple, can test. It didn't reclose by its own operation, but the system operator can say, well, you know, maybe it's the fault has cleared now, and so we're going to test it. We're going to try and see if it recloses. And during fire season, we basically would have policy restrictions on when you could attempt to do that test. And very big picture, without getting into the minutia, fire season is going to have more conservative policies, and then red flag days during fire season are going to have even the most restrictive or conservative approaches. So that was kind of my background. I mean, we have other things that we're doing, but those are the big picture items. And so any questions or any other areas that you wanted to question about or anything along those lines?
So if you're in a no test situation, it doesn't reclose, then you send someone out to look at it?
That's right.
That's right. And just to, there are situations in which testing is allowed. For example, if the relay wasn't available, and the recloser had not closed, but a relay wasn't available, we usually allow a test one time.
So in other words.
And the relay shovels it, shifts it off somewhere? The relay, when you say the relay's not available, what does that mean?
The information of why it didn't successfully reclose.
Right. So something didn't operate the way it was expected to, and you don't know what prevented it from doing that, then you can then the operator can pretend to be that or perform that function.
Thanks.
Okay.
The behind the piece of that short interruption that's worth noting is that on the system, about 80% of the faults on the overhead system are temporary in nature. So the reclosing function saves reliability, right? But it comes at a risk if it's if it's not, you know, if there's significant fire danger out there. So that's what we're trying to balance in that.
Right.
So have you been working on these? I mean, I imagine you've been working on these forever. It's just there's maybe heightened focus because of the magnitude of some of the fires that have been going on lately. Is that kind of a?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. That and some of this is driven of what's going on in California. I'd stress we're different from California. We're different geography. We're a different place, a different system. At the same time, we want to learn and understand what's going on there. And the magnitude of things that have occurred there is undeniably trending the wrong way. And in particular, the last 2 years have been amazingly bad from every metric that we see. But
the whole no test policy, we've had fire season operations for better than a decade or whatever. It's been a long-standing practice that kind of the East Coast never even had as a concept. So I know when we send in information about our transmission outages, and you know, you don't have certain things being sustained outages because you weren't allowed to test energize. It was surprising to certain parties that, you know, no, you're in fire season, so you can't do that. And so I think there's a growing awareness about how the West has operated in order to try and minimize that risk. And certainly with the situation in California, it's become more important for us to recognize and fine-tune our processes around it.
Right, and to come full circle, I just again emphasize that we're exhausting all other options, and we're considering all the different tools that we can look into before getting into de-energization. And so with that, I guess I can turn back to the de-energization question. Did you want me to just kind of give a background of San Diego and the SRBA?
Sure.
Okay. Some quick context on proactive de-energization. First thing I would emphasize is we've always had proactive de-energization in the sense that if there is an emergency and people's safety, there's an imminent threat, as the situation like I just mentioned, a big wildfire is headed right into a line. We've always had proactive de-energization in the sense that sometimes system operators will need to make that decision to de-energize a line. When we use the term proactive de-energization, I think that's taken on a different meaning, specifically because, and this is coming out of California, it goes back to after 2007, San Diego Gas and Electric was involved in some very bad fires in Southern California, and as early as 2009, they started looking into should we have more of a systematic approach to de-energize a line under specific conditions. That resulted in a decision affecting only them in 2012. For the past few years, it's been SDG&E only who has utilized this as one of the quote-unquote tools, of methods to use to try to mitigate this risk. The other utilities in California did not follow suit for a number of years, but because of the 2017 fire season, Southern Cal Edison and PG&E have since decided, no, we need to have programs as well. That prompted the California Commission to issue a resolution basically saying that the standards that we had for San Diego are going to apply to you. And then even recently, within just about a month ago, right, the California Commission is actually opening a rulemaking on this issue. Again, I'd emphasize California is a different state. You all are controlling what happens here in Utah, but we are following that. We're aware of it, and it certainly informs our thinking and helps us. We're trying to learn from that experience, basically, and want to keep you updated. We're particularly aware of it as a company because we have a service territory in Northern California. So, I mean, we're participating in that rulemaking, and we'll continue to learn from that and inform our efforts here. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back to you and talk about what de-energization specifically.
So in California, we were required to really put together a plan that would describe how we would go about doing that. That hasn't been anything that we're talking about necessarily in other states, but just wanted to make you aware that that could be something that in the future it might be something we come back to you about, and we want to have an understanding about what's really driving us to go that direction, and also understand what kind of consideration, what kind of elements you would want us to take into consideration for any kind of plans like that. What's really, for me behind it is that, you know, again, as part of our SQR, historically, we have planned outages that, you know, we try to give certain amount of notice for. We have a short notice provision if it is an emergency issue, and we would report those as not part of our underlying performance. The potential could occur that if you had a proactive de-energization action, it could be bigger than what a normal planned outage would look like, and you know, we need to make sure that we've thought about the things that are important for you guys before we would, you know, embark on that.
So, can I just ask a question? So we're talking about the California current proposal, they're doing the rulemaking, and that's specific to PG&E, for example, starting the fire, right? So,
no, actually, it would be specific to a utility like PG&E making a decision many hours in advance to de-energize a line based on climatic data, especially wind, fuel, moisture content.
That's being made before the fire exists.
There's no fire.
Right, but what we're talking about here is proactively de-energizing lines due to a threat that currently exists. Is that?
No, I mean, I think that traditionally speaking, we've always, and I'd emphasize that we're not disturbing. The system operators have to be able to de-energize in an emergency situation because of an existing fire. But in addition to that, if conditions were so extreme that even when there is not a fire actually happening at that moment in time, that there might be circumstances that would rise to the level of being an emergency itself that would warrant a de-energization.
Such as like a red flag warning that you might get, you know, if you're monitoring things and it's hot and there's a red flag warning, would that?
And Heidi can speak better to the specific technical levels, but in my mind, from a conceptual level, it would be more of like an extreme red flag.
Yeah.
You know, many red flag days in a row, and just the worst kind of conditions that you can imagine.
So you kind of make parameters around which you would implement this, you know, like.
Yeah, to speak to the California plan that was just completed, it is if you have sustained wind speeds in excess of a certain amount, and you have gusts in excess of a certain amount, and you have drought indices beyond a certain threshold, and you have a Fosberg fire weather index, which is isn't that exactly exciting? You're really thrilled about that one. But it takes those fire prevention monitoring numbers that are, you know, that people like CAL FIRE or the Forest Service use to manage the fire risk, and tries to put those and say, okay, if you exceed this, and you have this, and you may have a red flag warning, then you're in a candidate state, and that's how it was clarified for 2 areas that we serve in California. We haven't done that in any other state. It's just you know, be aware that that's kind of the direction that work has gone. And so, as Tim was saying, we're really trying to make sure that we're learning from those experiences and applying them in an appropriate way.
Does that thing take into consideration like pine bark beetle infestations and things like that? You know, like half the forest is dead. Does it consider that too?
So those pieces if I think about it from the fire threat districts that were developed in California, are really around a mapping effort that identifies where you've got elevated risk, and they would add, they actually kind of create, if you will, a centroid of a risk area. And then, you know, if you had a lot of fuel sitting there that could become the source of an ignition, and or the fuel to move an ignition, then that would be a concern. So SDG&E has used that process successfully, I think 3 times through the last year is what I saw the reports that they filed, and you know, so much better outcome than 2007 when, you know, there were homes burned and lives lost and such.
Yeah, and very limited circumstances, very extreme weather situation. Another factor, and this is part of the thinking phase, and there are a lot of questions, but for example, the places that I've seen SDG&E implement were, generally speaking, like extremely high elevation, because wind was such a great factor at that high elevation, whereas at the same time, low number of customers, and so there are a number of those kind of factors that could be playing into consideration as well. So,
is there any, like, after the fact evaluation, like you de-energize, and then after the fact, does someone go back and try and determine if that was necessary or appropriate? I'm just thinking, you know, people hate their power to be turned off. And
you mean in general, or you mean in California?
yeah, I guess in the rules in California.
In California, there are 3 elements that are required for the proactive de-energization. There's a notification and a customer impact mitigation process. There is a reasonableness demonstration, and then there is an after-the-fact report that's required. So beforehand, you need to understand the customers that you're going to impact and have a conversation to make sure that, you know, if it's a fire department with a lift station or something like that, you know, that you and they both understand what the implications are, or if it's a customer with medical issues that needs to be addressed, you need to have that take place. And then the reasonableness includes kind of the underlying metrics that were looked at in order to determine whether you made the right decision. So what were the forecasts and, you know, elements like that, and how does that compare against history that would lead to you expecting this to be an issue. And then in terms of when the work is completed, and there's also a certain amount of community, you know, like whether it's support, collaborative support for cooling centers or something similar to that. And then afterwards, there's a report on all of those elements that's required. And the attempt is to give 2 days of notification to at least emergency response professionals, if not to the area at large. And then, so 2 days there, and then 2 hours ahead of time before the de-energization occurs. And then you do have to file a report afterwards that clarifies the steps that were taken.
Thinking of your system in Utah right now, are there, there's lots of areas of the state that have fire potential, but there aren't many people living there. In the areas where this could affect people living there, are there certain pockets like Summit Park and, you know, places, you know, different areas that you've identified that have a bigger chance of this than others right now? That
Yeah, so we went through a fire mapping effort, a fire risk effort, which was trying to pattern after what had been done when California developed the statewide map. And we basically took the same concepts behind it, so it included the terrain, the weather history, the habitat that exists, and then looked at the top 100 fire weather days over the past 15 years. And then with those parameters, ran Monte Carlo simulations with random ignitions and modeled how big a fire would get with each of those 100 weather days to determine where, whether there were hot spots, if you will. And that got consolidated into a metric on a kilometer by kilometer basis. And it identified for us then a scale, if you will, a dimensionless but relative scale that allowed us to identify the areas that were of greater concern. And then we basically created our own kind of tier process. Tim talked about tiers 2 and 3. We did the same basic thing for the for Utah and identified those areas that were of greater concern. We had people like Scott argue with whether or not that was the right, did that make sense? Because obviously sometimes what a model reveals doesn't actually match as well what the local wisdom would suggest. And so there was some ground truthing of the model, and then it basically was it set the framework for that.
Oh, when you develop plans like that, this is going to show my ignorance of when I read my little bill insert recently, but have you mentioned some of these things in your bill inserts for people who may live in, like have a little write-up in a bill insert?
No, I'd emphasize that this is
very preliminary.
This is very preliminary.
Okay.
We're bringing to you first because we want to keep you informed and notified of thinking about these important topics. And there are no firm decisions
Well, I just meant
one way or the other.
notifications,
Yeah.
if somebody was gonna, you mentioned that you would notify the fire agencies and possibly the customers in certain areas, just so they would know that this might be.
Right, so that's in California in an area that we know to be
Oh, okay,
a proactive de-energization area.
Okay.
So I'm sorry if I confused it. Cheryl asked specifically about that process there. They're separate and distinct issues. And I guess I've tried to do some indexing, and I don't know if it's helpful, but if you consider San Diego as like 100 on the scale, it would appear that generally speaking, the next our Mount Shasta area, which is the highest fire risk area Pacific Corps serves, so all 6 states, ends up being the highest value, and you put it at like 33, so 1/3 of the threat level of San Diego, and then obviously everywhere else is something less than that. So just to kind of put it into perspective. Yeah.
The good news is that here in Utah we have a much lower fire. It's definitely a fire risk, and we're aware of it, and we want to mitigate it. But it is in magnitude very different from from California.
So that was it was really again just a recognition that when we kind of went to the file-only process with the service quality report, you asked that we make sure and keep you apprised of other things that would be affecting the network or could affect the network. And so we wanted to put this on your radar again.
Did you cover how this would go into like the next or service quality reports in the future?
No, I think that's really the ask for you guys. We historically would call this a planned interruption, right? And the question would end up being, if we ended up doing a proactive de-energization that affected, customer minutes interrupted, is there a proper way that you would want that reported in the service quality report, really is the policy question, I think, that we would like an answer on. We want to be very transparent about it.
So when you, one way to maybe get some information on that is when you file your report for last year, you make a specific ask in that and saying if we appreciate comments on this, and then when parties give comments, or we could have a technical conference. I mean, this is just a suggestion.
Well, and again, remembering that we haven't decided to do it
Sure,
yet.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
so we thought a little preliminary for that step,
Yeah.
but, I think even probably before we got to the point where we were at that step, we would keep you
Or maybe-
apprised. You know, if we get
Sure.
several months down the road and think, okay, well, this is, you know,
We're
a high,
actually going
we,
to-
yeah, like,
Yeah.
we're probably like now it's thinking about it.
Yeah.
If we remove like one or two of those thinking abouts, coming back to you and saying, okay, we're getting more serious and let's talk about it.
And so it would be essentially how to reflect this in calculating SAIDI and SAFE for the different breakouts.
Yeah, how you'd want to
Yeah.
see it service quality review
Yeah,
and or if there were other things that we should address with it. Anything else
Because we
think-
definitely want to know.
Yes, I would, at a minimum, yeah.
Yeah, or if,
Calculation.
yeah, and maybe you don't feel that it needs to be broken out, I don't know, but maybe you do.
I would-
or
I would want
others.
it broken out.
I was gonna say, I bet Cheryl's about to say, I would want it broken out.
I've trained Cheryl well, I would say that too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
even if we're doing this, we're talking about events that we hope are fairly rare.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we already have at least an understanding that if something occurs, that we would want an explanation for, that you will be offering that proactively in your reporting. I think there's been kind of that understanding for a few years anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, obviously, one of the choices would be to say you treat it like a major event filing, right? I mean, that could be what you would, one
Because then
response.
the number would be pulled out of the.
Right. So, I mean, those are, it really ends up being what makes the most sense to you so that it's clearly understood why an action was taken the way that it was.
Of course, then you have to do something with it. Major event filing.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that we're talking about something occurs that's relatively rare and fairly extreme. I mean, it's not like you're turning the power off for an hour for 5 people or something, you know. We're talking about something that's fairly significant, or would have a fairly significant impact. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, it is important to note, Chuck, that once you complete, so you do the de-energization before you restore power, you have to get your eyeballs on every piece of facility to make sure that there isn't any damage, right? Because otherwise, you'd be back in that potentially retesting into and creating an ignition source. So it does have, the duration is fairly lengthy, depending upon how substantial the geography is.
But the number of customers affected could potentially not be that big, right? I mean, if it's out in.
Depends on when,
Depending.
where,
Yeah,
and
I mean,
when,
yeah.
where, pretty much.
You know, and how they could route around things.
Well, and
I
back.
guess the question is how often has this happened in your experience in the last 5 years, say? I mean,
The most I can think of is where we've taken certain transmission lines out of service because of concerns of, ionizing gas or whatever. But those ended up having no reliability consequences. So that's the normal that we've experienced over time.
Experiencing, and so what we're talking about is at least something that heretofore has been a fairly unusual, rare event.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you look, again, we don't have any data because we have never done it. But if you, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard, you know, if San Diego's 100 and at our worst, which isn't even in Utah, it's Mount Shasta at 33, and San Diego, you said, because they do the proactive de-energization, and they've done it, we said 3 times in the last year.
Yeah.
So that extreme, and it's 3 times until you can kind of maybe extrapolate very loosely that it would be it would be a major event. And back to Teresa's framework, we would be notifying the commission. I mean, this would just happen, and then you'd hear about it 6 months later in the service quality report. You know, you would know.
I guess that's kind of what I'm
And that's why we wanted to
my
have this discussion now, so we kind of get the feel for how it would be in your minds, how we go about the reporting and whatever after we think about maybe the possibility of considering this, if it's something that, you know, how we would want to present it.
Well, I guess that's kind of where I'm getting at with my questions and comments is that it doesn't, other than I'm sure once you decide to do something, the commission would want to know what your plans are, but I don't see it being really part of the standard service quality report that you're...
Well, other than it affects the numbers.
Well, but again, it sounds like, to me, from what we're discussing, it sounds like the easiest way would be to just, it would be a major event filing that you would do anyway. I mean, if you're going to be affecting your reliability numbers in any significant way.
We would have to, you know, it would be a filing along the lines of a major event, but we'd have to kind of look into what the definition of a major event is, and it may be a little bit more than, you know, for us to, yeah. Because, you know, the major event is the, you know, has, yeah, right, yeah. And maybe that would satisfy it, but maybe it's not a good measurement to figure out what is.
Well, the TMED actually excludes planned outages, right? Because they're not they're not part of the normal distribution.
Right.
So if you call it planned, it's actually
right,
the wrong population.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe when you do, we should have so you've kind of got everybody thinking on this.
That was the point of this, is just to get you rolled around in your head, and I don't think we have to make any.
Maybe when you file the next report, we could have a service quality review meeting. People haven't had a chance to think. We could look at what the definitions, you know, look at the service quality rules again, you know, review those and see if there's change and, you know, and then, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I mean, I don't know if on an ongoing basis or how this would fit in, but especially like initially when you do, I want to know what the parameters, that, you know, your decision process, the red flag was up and it was dry and there were beetles and we had a lot of woody waste.
Beetles. No, we want to burn that. No, wait, go back.
That, yeah,
Anyway.
Because it may be, when we look at the rules, we could change something to put it, you know, just a category for this, and, you know, but I think now you've given us, in my mind, enough to start thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then we could think some more in the meantime, and once you file your thing, we could do the review of what we would need to do.
When does that due? Like June?
May 1.
May 1.
Yeah.
By then, we should have a better understanding of where we think we're gonna go with it. That might be a good time to just pick up the issue again. So, okay, so I will note that.
Yeah, and then we can review some things in the meantime, parties can, you know,
Some thoughts.
While you guys are
get
here,
some ideas.
Can I just ask a really ignorant question? My question before was really is there ever a time where the utilities infrastructure starts to fire? Is that what we're
Never.
I just don't know.
Tell
That was more my
them.
question. Does the
Yeah.
fire cause the risk?
It's possible.
Or
The answer is
Don't
yes.
listen to me. So I think like there's a lot of argument going on about, you know, what happened in wine country, California, or, you know, Thomas or whatever, the Thomas fire. But certainly as a minimum, what can happen is limbs can become airborne. They can come across conductors. When they come in contact with two or more conductors, can create a fault source, which can create an ignition point. And if you have the right.
So it wouldn't be like a lack of maintenance on the line, it would be an external environmental influence on the.
Well, we would always hope that it would be that, right? But I mean, there are a variety of reasons that you might have it. We've had situations where, you know, a bird gets into a transformer, they go flying off, they're on fire, and they start an ignition. I mean, there are those sorts of things that can happen.
Sorry, that was my question.
And with fires, poles too could be blown down, there could be contact there and things like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, they'd take their gun out there and shoot at our equipment.
But like an overheated conductor wouldn't spark? Could spark?
An overheated conductor will typically sag, right?
Right,
And then it
which
could-
would rub the tree line.
And if you haven't controlled your vegetation underneath the, we're getting back to how you blame the utility.
Yeah, I was like,
Stop blaming.
No.
you know what,
There's
just give us
contact.
like double the O&M and we'll go out and make sure those trees stay trimmed. No, and I think, are you getting at, do you de-energize to prevent, because you think maybe that your line's gonna start a
Right,
fire? Or
so-
that you
so-
think
so
a fire
say-
might
say you
start
had
some other
conditions.
way and hit your line and damage it? And that's the question, I think. Is that the question?
And I would say both.
Oh,
Okay.
We recognize that electricity and that a fire can start from the facility, either for a number of reasons, and
How would pole fires fit into this? Pole fires.
pole fires are certainly an example of how equipment can result in a fire. Fortunately,
They're
I
mostly
don't
at the
wanna
top
say
of
that
poles.
and I don't wanna say it's 100% never created a wildfire, but because of the correlation between pool fire and moisture, it's extremely rare that a pool fire would ever then
Cause a wildfire.
cause a wildfire.
Could you anticipate a pole fire in time to de-energize the line so you wouldn't have a bigger fire?
I would say that pole fires are
Seems like you could do that.
very low on the priority of concern. Wind-related faults are a much greater concern because of the correlation between wind that can damage facility and cause a fault, and wind is also the major ingredient in terms of a fire growing and becoming more damaging. So that's why any kind of models are going to factor wind speed and wind gusts as a major factor.
I don't know that Heidi would want you to say that pole fires are not a concern, since we had a lengthy discussion a few years ago about pole fires in this state, so, and what the company was supposed to be doing to mitigate the pole fires.
Yeah, so it's important though to keep in mind that wildfires are not correlated to pole fires, okay? So I agree with you.
I'm just
that-
making kind of a
Yeah.
a semi-funny joke.
Yeah, it's
Funny. Otherwise known as a jab.
Don't give up your day job.
I recognize
Okay.
jobs because I get them all the time.
Heidi, did you say that there's a California fire policy manual that you've got done, or are you working on that?
I'm sorry,
A California fire policy manual?
there's,
Do you have something that's already done?
so we were required to develop a proactive de-energization plan, is that what you're
Yeah.
asking about? Yeah.
Right.
And right now it's in final review internally, yeah.
So is that something we could see to kind of get an idea of where you're going there, and maybe we could design ours something around that?
So you could, what I would suggest is a good resource to start from would be the CPUC's Electric Safety and Reliability Branch has a website that's actually around de-energization, and they have filed information such as the post event reports from the IOUs that have implemented it. And it actually, I think, creates a good understanding of what the expectations are. And then I'm sure at some point when there's more detail that's locked in the stone in the California plan, I think we could share that, you know, with blacking out certain names.
I'll note that, because right now, I don't think it's in a final, it's not done. It's,
Right.
but once it is, you know, because I'm assuming we'll be filing that
I
with the
think
commission.
it's filing in February.
Okay, so I mean, that may be something when we meet again for our, because again, I don't know how much time you want to spend on it till it's a more sure thing, right? Again, if we meet in May to have another discussion, then that might be a good thing to maybe provide for that meeting or something like that. I can
Yeah,
maybe
if you
note
provide
that.
it in advance.
Yeah, I mean, we should have it well before that, but
Okay.
again, I would say we provide it right out in February, right after, if you want, but I don't know if you wanna wait until we're more further
We
down
offered
the
that,
line. Yeah.
I don't wanna create the wheel, let's, yeah, you guys do
Either
it
way,
first.
I mean, it just don't wanna, you know, create work that's not fruitful for you. Once we think it's something that you should, you know, that it's worth the time to look at, I think.
Or us, I just want to point out.
Oh, no, yeah.
And that is just the California plan at this point, that's February 4th is our filing due date.
Are you planning these for other states as well, like Oregon or just Utah, or what's?
We met with Idaho and had this discussion
Oh, okay.
already, and are you guys planning on meeting with Wyoming?
It hasn't come up yet as a conversation for
Okay.
Wyoming.
Yeah, but we have, you know, been in, obviously, discussions in California, and I'm not sure about other Pacific power states.
Oregon, yeah.
Oregon, okay. So, yeah. Anything
Great.
else?
Are we done? All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have